Welcome to News from Neptune for August 2nd, the 31st week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government a century ago, said, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to a generation of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China, etc. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Democrat Party's Over edition. Glenn Ford, the commentator from Black Agenda Report, writes, "The corporate Democrats would rather lose with Biden, or Harris and the rest, than win with Sanders, because the lords of capital will not permit one of their governing parties to be captured by opponents of endless austerity and war, the only program the ruling class has to offer in the 21st century. Endless austerity and war, we abbreviate here as neoliberalism and neoconservatism, but I think Glenn Ford is exactly right. They are much more concerned about maintaining control of the party than allowing these soi-disant socialists any room in the Democratic Party." You've been writing to the News Gazette again, David.
Yes, but before I go into that,
go ahead and let's comment on this.
Well, you know, I'm making this up, but I'm putting myself in the heads of the people you refer to who anybody but Sanders or anybody but Warren kind of people, who probably recognize that Biden is not working out all that well, and I didn't watch them. I didn't watch what happened the last couple of.
You have no sense. You have no sense of penance.
I wasn't invited. I wasn't invited anywhere that I could watch it, and I don't get that station. Not that I would have watched it if I had, but when I put myself into their heads, I'm thinking that they're thinking that Kamala Harris would be somebody they would really get behind, you know, beyond Biden. But she just doesn't quite have the charismatic qualities that Obama had in 28 or up until 2008.
Harris doesn't.
Harris doesn't. She just doesn't quite. She doesn't quite have that jaunty style. I mean, Obama effected this very charismatic style. He kind of did the black man thing, but he did the educated black man thing, you know. And Harris isn't very good at that. And I mean, you know, Obama had one white parent, just like she does. So I'm not sure what the problem is there, but she just isn't. I don't think she's able, from what I hear of her, or what I see, little snippets I see of her, she isn't quite able to pull off that kind of routine. Plus, you know, Obama did it first, so people are going to be wise to her, and they're not going to go for the same thing that Obama pulled off in 2008. Plus, Obama was going against Hillary Clinton. He was supposedly running to her left, whereas Harris is obviously running, pretend as she will, she is running to the right of Sanders and Warren and to a certain extent Tulsi Gabbard. So that's it. That's my off the head, unempirical, speculative comment about what's going on right now.
I think it's important to see, and it certainly is clearer now, how much the Trump presidency is Obama's legacy. If in fact Obama had been the progressive that he claimed to be, the anti-war progressive that he claimed to be to get elected, instead of the warmonger, mass deporter, and all-around corporate shill he instead chose to be, Americans would not have been driven to the desperate act of electing the crazy rich Republican over Clinton, the Democrat bearing Obama's endorsement. His comment made this week, and I think that's exactly right. The result of the 2016 election was not at all about Trump's personality, however peculiar it might be. It was much more about the disappointed hopes of American populism, of the mood that produced the Obama presidency and its promise of hope and change. When Obama turned out to be even more false to his advertising than Trump turned out to be to his, then what people looked around for was something different. And what they found was Donald Trump. How different he actually was is a paradoxical question because, of course, although Trump became president by being the first major party candidate in 40 years to attack neoliberalism and neoconservatism, in fact, as soon as he got into office, his policies hewed back to the neoliberal and neoconservative policies, war and austerity, of the Obama administration. So the last case is worse than the first, and we have a situation which depends upon the popular opposition of the policies of war and austerity that characterize all recent administrations, but because of the machinations of the political class, end up reproducing those policies in a new administration. And it's not at all clear that it's going to be avoided in the next election.
Yeah, there's an anthropologist, a venerable, reputable anthropologist named Marshall Salins, or Salins, Sahlins, who has the top article on the Counterpunch website this morning, although I don't recall him writing there before. Maybe I assume he probably has. And it kind of gets into this. I don't agree with part of what he's saying here, but it's worth putting on the table regarding what's happening in Trump land, what's happening with the opioid crisis, and so on and so forth. And what he writes, an excerpt of what he writes is, according to a sophisticated analysis that appeared in last year's JAMA, that's the reputable Journal of the American Medical Association, quote, socioeconomic conditions, quote unquote, account for only 2/3 of the Trump opioid connection, which is to say the economic decline is not enough to explain why these people in the heartland, these white people, are voting for Trump. And then Salins goes on, then again, many equally precarious Black and Hispanic communities elsewhere in the country have neither turned massively to Trump or to opioids. Clearly, there is something different about the culture of opioid country. What is immediately different for indigent people in rural Kentucky or the Mahoning Valley of Ohio is that so far as they are concerned, they didn't simply lose their jobs. The blacks got them because the government favors blacks in the eyes of these white people. And then Salins goes on, as Sean McAwee reported in Salon during the 2016 campaign, these Trump supporters experience their pain as discrimination and victimization. Quote, quoting McAwee, racism is the real driver of Trump's success, he wrote. Social pain is understood through the lens of racial animus, end quote, by Salins. Mostly, and then Salins goes on, mostly it was blacks and it could be Mexicans or immigrants or foreigners in other contexts. The victimized people expressed equal opportunity animus toward Muslims, gays, lesbians, coastal elites, Harvard and Washington. beyond the economic decline that set it off, the threat was existential, as if their whole way of life was an endangered cultural species. And I only read this. I mean, I was going to make a comment along these lines. I'm not really endorsing this comment, but along these lines and contiguous of what we've been arguing in previous weeks, it seems to me it is less and less helpful to think of politics in this country in terms of race, and it is less and less helpful to think of the Democratic. It is more and more helpful to think of the Democratic Party, the mainstream Democratic Party, as wanting to use race as a wedge issue. After all, these people the Democratic Party wants some of these these supposedly disaffected or these genuinely disaffected white people to vote for their next candidate who didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And it would be good if whatever their attitudes are and whatever they attribute their conditions to, it would be helpful to focus on what the objective material conditions are, whatever their mental processing of those might be.
I think that's right. I think the problem is that the supposedly liberal political positions of recent years have been, and by recent years I mean more than a generation, the liberal positions have been purposely or not setting racial groups against one another rather than solving the very real social problems in the United States. I heard regularly, I used to live in a working class section of Boston, and I heard regularly from my neighbors, and the lines were fairly clearly drawn. There was a main road, and the houses on the right of that road were white, and the houses to the left were black. My neighbors would typically say the government does everything for the blacks and nothing for us. This is an Irish working class area of Boston. And there was just enough truth in that in days of affirmative action for them to see that the real problems that they faced, the problems that grew substantially over that last 40 years, were being treated by this divisive mechanism constructed by American liberals. And the same American liberals were around in the Clinton campaign deploring the deplorables. That is, those people who did not buy this pipe dream that American liberalism was putting forward in those years. And the very real social burdens that grew for Americans in a generation in which the expansion of post-war America had long come to an end. The very real burdens they carried were compounded by good liberals calling them racists. And I mean, the way out is not affirmative action. The way out is social transformation. And affirmative action and things like that just make it worse. So until we recognize that, and of course we didn't recognize it at all until the populist wave rose up and produced a very peculiar example of the dismay many Americans were feeling in Donald Trump. Trump actually had said some right things, some correct things in the campaign. In office, he didn't follow them.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess one thing that people would say is, well, there was a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood in Boston where you lived, but in some of these Midwest, these heartland places that voted for Trump, there's not a black person to be found, or there isn't an immigrant person to be found. So what's up with these people? But that doesn't mean anything. If these people see what's going on around them and they read the papers and it might be interesting to understand what it means not to have any personal experience with the people that you supposedly think are getting all the good stuff. But again, what is their material circumstances? What have they experienced in their lifetimes, and how do they explain that? And how did Trump tap into the way they explain that to themselves? I'm not happy with that. I'm not happy with the fact that too many people misunderstand what the origins of their circumstances are. But I can hardly blame them, given the nature of the mainstream media, given the nature of the educational system. I could hardly blame them for not having an in-depth, nuanced understanding of all the economic forces that have impacted their lives. So that's what people do. They want to explain something in some way, and even in this context, he's saying, well, that only explains 1/3. I mean, when you look at opioids and you look at Trumpism and you look at all this, that only the whole race issue only explains one part of that, and not even most of that. But somehow we're supposed to show up for anti-racism and think that that's where we should be going.
And of course, it's important that we show up for anti-racism, but
not in the way we were talking about last week by Taliban-style painting over murals in San Francisco. But yeah,
that's right.
that aside.
But yeah, but the problem here is that we're dealing in an intellectual world, the world of the American voters, that is strongly conditioned by the greatest propaganda system in the world, that is the American media. And so we're told all these stories by the American media, and out of that people construct an account of their difficulties. Why is my life the way it is? Why are the possibilities that my parents had a generation ago not available to me today? Well, the answers that they're offered by American media includes racist accounts of where we are. It's a sophisticated system, the American media's propaganda, but it's a system they've been working on for a while, and they've gotten pretty good at it. And to combat that, we can't accept that account, but we have to challenge it, and that's important. Glenn Ford, who I was quoting a moment ago in his article for Black Agenda Report, which I'll place on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, says, if only a few percent of Trump's blue-collar whites in 2 or 3 states can be peeled away, his presidency is doomed. I mean, remember that, of course, in spite of the populist wave that produced Trump, he actually lost the popular vote, and he won because of the votes in Pennsylvania and Michigan and elsewhere that delivered areas to his electoral college vote that he had not expected to have. The Obama voters stayed home, and the votes went to the electoral college vote went to Trump. And so Ford writes, if only a few percent of Trump's blue-collar whites in 2 or 3 states can be peeled away, his presidency is doomed. Sanders is the only candidate that can do it, and therefore the only electable Democrat. Black people can readily understand that logic, which also frees them to vote their own leftish hopes rather than their fears. I don't know if Ford's right about this, but that certainly is an arguable position. That's why, and as he says, the corporate Democrats would rather lose with Biden than win with Sanders, because the Lords of Capital, because it would mean turning the party, so to speak, over to the insurgent forces that Sanders represents. The Lords of Capital will not permit one of their governing parties to be captured by opponents of endless austerity and war. which is what Sanders is. The only program the ruling class has to offer in the 21st century, as it is offered for the last generation. Well, I think that's right. And it seems to me that the desperate Clinton line, we have to vote against the racist deplorables, won't get you very far in that world. You're watching News from Neptune. We have a good number of things on our agenda.
Yeah, let me just read one thing here that I came across just at the last minute, which is why I was almost late. One of the editors of the News Gazette is upset with me for my recent letter criticizing Julie Wirth. He took it kind of personally. He said Julie Wirth would never take it personally, but he did. That sounds like it might be a little chauvinist to me, but still I'll let that go. You know, he says that in my criticism of her goes to the sort of she does some good work, but my criticism of her goes to the kind of softball U of I publicity journalism that she's been doing. What really got my goat a while back was this interview she did with Larry Geese, the guy who gave $150 million to the business school, and nobody, the News Gazette has never explained to us what is it that Larry Geese does to make $500 million or whatever he's worth, that he can give $150 million of it and more to other causes away. And so I looked at this article today on the front page, a Julie Wirth article on something going on campus, because that's her beat, the campus beat. And she has done a good job of covering, as Jeff Delisio pointed out to me, she's done a good job of covering some of the difficult accusations that have been made lately against U of I faculty members, presumably of the Me Too variety. But be that as it may, she wrote an article this morning that was fed to her by the U of I press corps regarding the $11 million given to the Blue Waters computer, blah, 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 that gets a lot of money. And why is this on the front page? I don't know. Why is it different from a lot of money that people get to do research of various kinds? Well, it all has to do with the fact that this is our campus, and the News Gazette wants us to be really identified with whatever high-tech thing is going on, with whatever allegedly cutting-edge thing is going on that makes the U of I so reputable around the country and puts Champaign-Urbana on the map, so to speak. This is what a small-town newspaper does to make it feel like it's not a small town. But sorry, it's still a small town. But anyway, I just stumbled over this. What she's talking about with this Blue Waters thing is something that's being spotted, and I think people thought they're mapping, Antarctica. They're doing this highly specialized, powerful geographical computer mapping, detailed mapping of these regions. And I thought, well, but that must have something to do with climate change, like finding out, how the polar ice caps are breaking down or whatever. But I look at this National Geospatial Intelligence Agency in their Wikipedia article, and I found the following. The National Geospatial Intelligence, that's the word that sent me looking for this, agency, NGA, is a combat support agency under the United States Department of Defense and a member of the United States intelligence community. I didn't even know. There's a link to that. I didn't know that the United States intelligence community was even a thing, except in a kind of informal sense. But apparently they have their own, Wikipedia entry, with the primary mission of collecting, analyzing, and distributing geospatial intelligence, spelled GEOINT in capital letters, in support of national security, which is also underlined, which is a thing. NGA, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, was known as the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, NEMA, until 2003. NGA headquarters, also known as NGA Campus East, is located at at Fort Belvoir North area in Virginia. Obviously not far from the CIA and places like that. The agency also operates major facilities in the St. Louis, Missouri area, as well as support and liaison offices worldwide. The NGA headquarters at 2.3 million square feet is the third largest government building in the Washington metropolitan area after the Pentagon and the Ronald Reagan building. Which is the Justice Building? Is that what the Ronald Reagan?
I think that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Anyway, in addition to using GeoInt for U.S. military and intelligence efforts, the NGA provides assistance during natural and man-made disasters. I suppose a good thing. Not man-made disasters, but helping providing assistance, and security planning for major events such as the Olympic Games. In September 2018, researchers at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency released a high-resolution terrain map, detail drawn to the size of a car and less in some areas, of Antarctica. That's what's being referred to with the blue waters, named the Reference Elevation Model of Antarctica, REMA, R-E-M-A. So, enough acronyms for you, Carl?
Yeah, I'm making up some of my own while you talk.
And so what I'm saying here, Julie Worth, and I know you're watching because once I criticized you publicly, you got to be watching to find out who the hell is this guy. What you might want to do is ask when you do a next softball interview, which I'm sure this whole process of her doing this interview and writing this up couldn't have taken more than 2 or 3 hours. What she does with the rest of her day, I don't know. But still, and I'm not saying I work more than 2 or 3 hours every day either. I don't. But that beyond, unless you count dance classes. But that aside, you might want to ask, instead of just saying, "Isn't it great the U of I got $11 million?" Ask, "What's it for? Is it in the public interest for them to be spending this money doing this geospatial mapping? For what reason? And why doesn't it have anything to do with climate change? Isn't that what we should be worried about? Climate change, the breaking down of the polar ice caps or the Antarctic ice caps or whatever's going on. You hear more about the North Pole. This seemed to be about the South Pole. I know, but there must be some climate nonsense going on down there too. So just not informing the public by informing them is what this is. So I'm just doubling down. Jeff, I'm sorry you're going to be mad at me, but my next letter might have to be about this just to reinforce what I'm getting at here.
You raised an interesting question here, as a matter of fact, triggered, if you like, by the reference to the structure. The Ronald Reagan Building, and I'm trying to remember exactly what that was before it became the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington. The Ronald Reagan Building International Trade Center is located in downtown D.C., and it is the first federal building in Washington, so it's described, designed for both government and private sector purposes.
Public-private partnerships.
There we go.
That's
exactly.
what the last article Julie Worth was with the Discovery Department Institute. You just, whenever you say public-private partnership, you've got a halo around your head.
It gets curiouser and curiouser. Public-private partnership is the polite way of speaking of neoliberalism, of course.
Yes.
Listen to the description of this building. Each of the organizations located in the Pennsylvania Avenue building, I'm sure I know where that is dedicated to international trade and globalization. I mean, what could be a more vigorous presentation of the neoliberal enthusiasm? Organizations headquartered in this building include the U.S. Agency for International Development, which of course has nothing to do with the CIA, U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Have they been in the news recently?
I haven't heard.
And the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, a propaganda organization of the first order. The first private sector lease, part of the building given consciously and purposely to a, quote, private sector group, was with the investment banking firm Quarterdeck Investment Partners. The building hosts conferences, trade shows, cultural events, and outdoor concerts. Post 9/11, security requirements for high-profile federal buildings have limited the amount of public-private access anticipated by the center's designers. Okay, I mean, what we have here is an edifice complex, a clear indication of the neoliberal policies of all recent administrations. It is properly named for Ronald Reagan, but of course the policies that it's representing here grew through and after and the Reagan administration to its present to their present state of efflorescence. I suppose we need physical reminders of exactly what's going on in our government because we don't talk about it.
Yeah, and I mean, you could see how these things tie into each other, and the questions that aren't asked. Where does the private investment money come from? How is it that people get all this money? Whether that Larry Geese is getting all this money from people to buy companies and then profit off what those companies do, or that the Discovery Partners Institute is this public-private partnership thing where you get $500 million of the state money and $500 million of private money to develop these gadgets and gizmos that I was referring to in my. I'm not saying this research is bad. I'm not saying the medical research is bad. I'm not saying the computer research is bad, although you should ask what the nefarious purposes of those things might be in terms of, say, drone warfare or spying on people and that sort of thing. That's the kind of questions Julie Worth should be asking. But the News Gazette editorial policy contrasts their editorial within the last week or so of the fact that the Champaign City Council raised the sales tax for eating for restaurant customers by 2 cents in order to raise $5 or $6 million to add to their maybe add to their $80 or $90 million operating budget to do a few things that they feel needed to be done. Contrast the News Gazette's editor's response to that, which was, well, you better be careful about spending, and you got to make choices, and boy, that's what government is. You just can't have everything you want, and sort of pointing the finger at them. Contrast that to their attitude about the $500 million that their hated governor, J.B. Pritzker, is giving to the Discovery Partners Institute to be matched, just because that's being matched by $500 million in private money. Oh, that's great, that's okay. Where did that $500 million come from? The News Gazette doesn't care because it goes into the neoliberal pot, and somehow once you say investors, you're talking job creators, and that's all pure and good. The halo is around the heads of those people, and we could move on without asking how that $1 billion is going to be used, why it should be used for that and not something else.
You're listening to News from Neptune. We have a couple of anniversaries, a couple of birthdays to mention this week. The 2 U.S. soldiers who were killed in Afghanistan on Monday were a 20-year-old PFC, Brandon J. Kreischer, and a 24-year-old SPC, Michael Isaiah Nance, from Chicago. Kreischer was 2 years old when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001. Nance was 6. This is the war that we are fighting in Afghanistan, one of the 8 wars the present administration inherited from the last administration, and that are still going on, and that were barely mentioned in the 2 nights of Democratic debates this week. There was another birthday this week that struck my eye. Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead, who happened to be my age, and died a few years ago, was born, his birthday occurred this week. Jerry said many years ago, at the height of his fame, somebody has to do something. And it's just incredibly pathetic that it has to be us. Well, I think that's right. It was right then, and it's right now, as we listen to the nonsensical animadversions of the Democratic wannabe candidates this week. It was a shocking display, and the best thing that came out of it, I think, was pointed out by our friend Jeffrey Sinclair at Counterpunch. Tulsi Gabbard's utter destruction of Kamala Harris was by far the high point of the debate. Tulsi Gabbard torches Kamala on criminal justice. I'm delighted that Tulsi exposed this heartless, opportunistic cop before a national audience. May Harris's poll numbers plummet along with her on the way to hell. That seems to me to be about right, and it was certainly the high point of the two nights. And I want to say something about Tulsi Gabbard, who is emerged from this Michigas as the only anti-war candidate in the whole business. The best comment on the exercise as a whole was someone pointing out that the evening in which Warren and Biden and the evening in which the second evening in which Biden was the central fixture, reminded him of the family trying to convince the paterfamilias to go into a nursing home, and I think that's not a bad notion of what the evening was like.
I haven't gone into the background of every single candidate that much, but I know that I ran across a YouTube video of Kamala Harris's speech before AIPAC of 2 or 3 years back, or maybe longer, which of course would prevent me from voting for her in under almost any circumstances. I just hope, for whatever reason, I hope that Tulsi doesn't have any skeleton like that in her closet. I know she's not exactly pro-Palestinian, and it doesn't bother me at all that she said in defending her vote, her anti-BDS vote, she said something about, it really wasn't a bill that repressed or criminalized BDS work. She said she wouldn't do that. I haven't gone into that deeply to know if that's just weasel words on her part. And I know that she hasn't been at the forefront of serious promotion of a serious peace in the Middle East. But when she says she's for 2 states, I can accept that. I'm for 2 states too. But the question is, what are the consequences that Israel should be getting for preventing a genuine two-state solution for the last, or at least since Oslo '93, when everybody thought that was what was supposed to happen, although they've obviously been preventing it for much longer.
Our chief researcher, Jeff Nicholson, who is a severe critic of Tulsi Gabbard and deplores my tentative enthusiasm for Gabbard, went to the trouble of transcribing Gabbard's comments on this particular vote. This was H.R. 246, I think, was the description, a resolution which actually apparently doesn't have much legal effect. It just asserts the sense of the Congress that deplores the boycott, divestment movement that BDS. Here it is, H.R. 246.
That's what you said, yeah.
Yes,
Easy number. They should name all bills like that.
Gabbard wrote, and we have this, as I say, thanks to Jeff Nicholson. Gabbard wrote, "Some of you have sent me messages and posted on social media asking for more information about why I voted the way I did on a recent resolution talking about BDS. So I wanted to give you some background and talk to you about my commitment to defending our First Amendment rights. Nothing is more fundamental to the identity of our country than the rights and freedoms that are enshrined in our Constitution. Now, I've fought to defend these freedoms both as a soldier and as a congresswoman. It's why we'll continue to oppose unconstitutional legislation like S1, a bill that does seek to restrict freedom of speech by imposing legal penalties against those who participate in the BDS movement. That's why I co-sponsored H.R. 496 to affirm our freedom of speech and right to protest or boycott for any cause, as well as stating opposition to any legislative efforts that seek to restrict these fundamental First Amendment rights. Now I voted for H.R. 246 because I support a two-state solution that provides for the rights of both Israel and Palestine to exist and for their people to live in peace with security in their homes. I don't believe BDS is the way to accomplish that. She's not entirely alone with that, as we know. Even people whose views we much admire, like Chomsky notably, would actually agree with that. However, I will continue to defend those who choose to exercise their right to free speech without any threat of legal action. Now, H.R. 246 does not in any way limit or hinder our First Amendment rights. In fact, it affirms every American's right to exercise free speech for or against U.S. foreign policy, as well as the right of Israeli and Palestinian people to live in safe and sovereign states, free from fear and violence, and with mutual recognition. The right to protest the actions of our government is essential if America is to truly be a free society. So no matter what our disagreements are about various political positions or choices that our government makes, we can all agree that every American should have the freedom to make those disagreements known and to protest peacefully in support of their views, close quote. Okay, now that's clearly an exercise in trying to justify this particular move, which, as I say, apparently has no legal effect. And it rightfully points out that similar measures that have an actual legal effect, like S1, are to be deplored. All right, I think it would have been better had she voted against H.R. 246, but she didn't, and she didn't for reasons that are marginally respectable here, although our researcher Jeff Nicholson doesn't think so.
Well, the politics behind that is that, you know, who's missing from the squad? Why is it just those 4 people, or maybe now 3? Because Presley voted against that along with her. But you know, she doesn't necessarily want to be associated with the squad in a kind of more literal way, and that's fine. I mean, she's running for president, and the squad isn't. But although it would be nice to have like 3 women presidents at the same time. But anyway.
While we're talking about Gabbard and her participation in the Democratic debates this week, the high point of which was her absolute destruction of Kamala Harris and the revelation of the sorts of things that Harris, as Attorney General of California, was doing, including using prisoners for paying work and not releasing them when they could be released because of their usefulness as unpaid employees. There's a name for that, isn't there? I mean, didn't we make come to some conclusions about that a century and a half ago? In any case, the revelations about Harris's positions were so devastating that people were astonished at what Gabbard actually had to say about that, and revealing what indeed Harris was doing in these matters. But the even more remarkable thing was Harris's response. Basically, what Kamala Harris said in response to this devastating attack from Gabbard is, well, that's what she would say, wouldn't she? She's an Assad apologist. I mean, look, that's hardly to believe. Look what she was saying. Yeah. She said, of course, this accurate account of the wretched things that I'm doing, as I did as Attorney General, is only to be expected from Tulsi Gabbard because she supports the president of Syria, who we know is an international criminal. Now, I think once again, it's true that the president of Syria is an international criminal, but to call Gabbard's activities as support for those crimes is astonishing. And to go further and suggest, as Harris's people have, that Gabbard is attacking Harris only because she's put up to it by Russian bots is not to be believed.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
incredible.
That's just back, back to the point of the general idea of accusing people of being racist and this and that, especially when that sort of thing is coming from, an elite, self-righteous elite class of people who demonize the Soviet Union or demonize Russia. And they could say that they're demonizing Putin, that it isn't racist, but there's a real racist and sort of culturalist element to what's being done by those people who are most focused on anti-black racism or maybe other kinds of racism, anti-immigrant racism and so forth, as if the whole Russiagate thing among the liberals is just, it doesn't have a kind of racist element to it, going back to what our whole history with Russia has been since 1917.
A friend writes, Kamala Harris calling Tulsi Gabbard an Assad apologist shows me two things. One, Harris cannot defend herself on the substance of Gabbard's attacks and resorts to name-calling on an unrelated issue. Two, she has little or no understanding of U.S. intervention and regime change in Syria. I think she's a U.S. senator, so that is a little embarrassing, but I think that's right. The astonishing charge that Harris makes against Gabbard, that she's an Assad apologist, actually, it astonished me. I couldn't believe that they would, instead of responding to what Gabbard actually said, she would take up an irrelevant matter of the Russiagate sort, part of the Russiagate nonsense, and use that against Gabbard. We need a much more serious discussion of these matters.
So,
what's next?
Well, let me try this.
Okay.
I wanted to fit this in. I've been, and it kind of, one of those things that I was kind of wondering, how am I going to present this? And then there it was right before my very eyes. It's been long clear to me, I think anybody who's probably watching this show probably realizes by now that the term first responders has become, as you like to say, a kind of term of art. There are first responders. They used to be called firemen, policemen, ambulance people, medics, whatever. These have been lumped into the category of first responders. And what is this category, and why am I concerned about this? Well, it's clear that as I was watching an ad during a baseball game, which is the only thing I watch on sort of over-the-air television. As I was watching an ad, there's a show on Fox called First Responders Live. And it shows a bunch of white guys who are pretty typical, good-looking first responder types doing what they do. And apparently these programs are about them doing what they do. And it's become clear to me, it hasn't been worth saying until now, but I kind of wanted to say it, that the whole militaristic post-9/11 culture, the military culture, the sports culture, all of those elements of militarism, the cult of veterans, all of this, the first responder term is folded into this, and a part of this culture of people being told that there are those people in our society who stand in the breach, as the saying goes, against evil, and that we have to venerate these people. And it's obviously, certainly true that they first responders perform an obviously important function, are by and large, I am sure, quite decent people and good at their work. I just don't like the militaristic, cult-like overtones in the way it's being promoted in the media right now. And what especially put me over the top is the realization now that Fox, I think it's Fox, has got hold of this, and they're running with it, just like they ran with the cop, all of these cop shows, whatever they were called, and what kind of puts the ribbon on this bow is what happened, what showed up on Amy Goodman this morning, a story called "You're Gonna Kill Me," quote unquote. Body cam video shows Dallas officers mocking man as he died pinned to ground. Now, this story is 2 years old, but as these things happen, it's only coming out now. In August 2016, 32-year-old Tony Timpa called 911 to ask for help. Timpa had schizophrenia and depression and was off his medication for schizophrenia. Timpa told the Dallas dispatcher that he was scared. The police responded, and within 20 minutes, Timpa was dead. For the past 3 years, the city of Dallas has fought efforts. I'm not sure why it's 3 years, because this happened. I'm sorry, it is 3 years ago. My bad math. The city of Dallas has fought efforts to release police body cam footage showing what happened, but the video was finally released this week after a prolonged legal battle. The shocking video contains disturbing footage with officers arriving on the scene where Timpa was already handcuffed by a private security guard. In the video, Timpa repeatedly pleaded for his life. Police officers mocked Timpa as he died. I'm not doing this to cast any criticism on first responders or on other people in Dallas. I'm just saying that when all we get is this kind of cult-like understanding of first responders wrapped in with our militaristic standing in the breach kind of culture, then we've got to challenge that.
A note from Jefferson Clare of Counterpunch on the Democrats and the drama that we observed this week in the two Democratic debates of this week. A melodrama is probably closer to the truth, and it's pretty poor stuff to begin with. Jeffrey writes, and I think he's right, it's becoming increasingly clear that the frisson between Biden and Harris, Vice President Biden and Senator Harris, is almost completely manufactured. A political breakup to make up, rom-com, where after a few months of clawing and scratching each other, Biden taps Harris for his VP candidate and promises to hand her the reins after 4 years. I think that may be news before the fact that's important and does describe what's going on in the Democratic debates, where the real issue, the underlying issue, is the need to maintain control of the party on the parts of the Lords of Capital, as Jeffrey says elsewhere, and avoid the populist enthusiasms that are represented, for example, in Medicare for All by Senator Sanders. Someone had a nice comment on the Medicare for All stuff. Medicare for All is cheaper than the current system, but it would deprive millions of Americans of the chronic fear, stress, and anxiety associated with paying for health care, and our nation just isn't ready for that.
Yeah, there's Matt.
That's a joke.
Yeah. The People's Policy. Why am I thinking of Matt Brunig, the People's Policy Project guy, says that the idea that people want their health insurance and don't want to lose their health insurance. Then he listed how many millions of people every year do lose their private health insurance, and he listed the 15 or 20 or 30 ways in which they do it, whether it's by losing their jobs or being kicked off or getting married or getting unmarried or whatever. There's lots and lots of ways that millions and millions of people lose their private health insurance every year, which is what makes this absurd claim that, gosh, people want to keep, and George Will, of course, has been making that that somehow people just can't stand the truth about the expense of public insurance versus private insurance is so obvious that they just have to make up the most ridiculous nonsense to counter it. So we got 2 or 3 minutes left
Okay.
here. And I'm done. You got? I don't know if you got anything.
Well, there's the question is the matter is a matter of choice. Where do we go? What do we put on the on the last minute? There's a war in Afghanistan. I haven't heard much about that.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that one of the most remarkable things about the Democratic debates is how it was largely and completely ignored. The one figure in the Democratic debate who tried to make something of his participation in that war, Pete Buttigieg, was, I thought, rather carefully put aside by most of the discussion and really didn't make too much of an impression. We spent the program here on last Tuesday talking about Nathan Robinson's careful description of the Buttigieg campaign or candidacy. And I may not be over, we may hear more of that, but for most of the other proto-candidates, there was very little time spent on any questions of war, and that's simply wrong. Given what the United States is doing in the world today, Trump is not the problem, but U.S. war-making certainly is, and the maintenance of the war stance that the U.S. has towards the rest of the world, most notably towards Russia and China, in order to prevent economic competition from Russia and China, or to lessen it, is the long-term problem that we should be talking about. And Trump's move this week on on tariffs is part of that long-term foreign policy. If we were having a real political discussion in this country, we'd be talking about that.
Well, we should return to that next week.
You have been watching News from Neptune for the 31st week of 2019, a Democrat Party's Over edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. See the research notes from J.B. Nicholson on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. And Jerry Garcia said almost the same thing. In the meantime, confusion.
I'm afraid that younger viewers only, when they hear Jerry Garcia, all they think of is a flavor of Ben and Jerry's ice cream. But anyway, or cherry. Did you say Cherry Garcia? Anyway.
The ability of American capitalism to turn serious issues into trivialities has often been noted.
Yes, it has. And will be again in the future.
In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.